techniques in, the mid 20th century that allowed scientists to actually map these routes. But the Quran used this peg metaphor, like, how a tent would be pegged into the ground 1400 years ago. Again, that's pretty good. But it doesn't just stop there. Now we have tectonic plate theory. So, Surah al-Abinya, chapter 21, verse 31 states this: "And we have placed on the earth firm mountains, lest it should shake with them." Again, this is describing the geological function of the mountains that wasn't understood until recently. So, modern tectonic plate theory, something scientists have only really started to agree upon in like the 60s, shows that mountains form where tectonic plates meet, and they actually help keep those shaky areas more stable. So when two continental plates crash into each other, the pressure pushes the mountain range up, and they act as stabilizers along the fault lines. A solid example of this is like the Himalayas that are formed, in between the Indian and the, Eurasian tectonic plates where they collide. And they actually help keep the area more balanced. Again, interesting, the idea that the mountains actually help, balance the, seismic activity in tectonic regions, which again, seems like the Quran kind of got that one right. Again, as a Catholic, I'm a little reluctant. I'm like, all right, they got one there. That's pretty good. Imagine this. You're 30 feet underground, digging through frozen earth with spoons and mess hall plates. Nazi guards patrol overhead. One wrong move, one loose pebble, and it's over. But on this night in 1944, 76 Allied prisoners would attempt the impossible, tunneling their way to freedom in the largest prisoner of war escape of World War II. And centuries earlier, in a cold stone chamber, a teenage girl in armor stood before her accusers. Her crime? Leading armies, speaking to angels, and daring to challenge the most powerful men in Europe. Joan of Arc's trial would become one of history's most infamous moments. These are just two stories from Today in History, the newsletter that brings you the most fascinating events from the past, delivered fresh to your inbox. From epic wars to religious rebellions, ancient mysteries to modern marvels. Don't miss another piece of history. Scan the QR code now or click the link in the description to sign up for Today in History. Moving on to another earth science topic, the water cycle. So in the Quran, there are various stages of the water cycle that are, brought up in multiple different verses. So for example, in Surah Ar-Rum, chapter 30, verse 48, it says, "It is Allah who sends the winds and they stir the clouds and spread them in the sky however he wills. And he makes them fragments so you see the rain emerge from within them." This seems like it, pretty accurately describes how winds transport water vapor, which condenses to form clouds and then eventually rain. Another verse, Surah Al-Raf, chapter 7, verse 57. It's another verse that explains how the winds bring in rain and it revives dead lands and it grows fruit, and then ties that process to how God can bring the dead back to life. Kind of a poetic way to connect nature to something a bit more mystical. It says, "And it is he who sends the winds and the good news before his mercy. When they carry heavy rain clouds, we drive them to lifeless land. Then we send down rain, with it bring all kinds of fruit. Just like that, we will bring the dead back to life. Maybe this will make you reflect." I like how the verse ends like that. Like, this is going to make you think, all right? How about this is like a little riddle? How about you guys figure this out? Reflect on that. And then to add to it, there's another verse that states, "And we have sent down the rain from the sky in a measured amount and settled it on earth. And indeed, we are able to take it away." This refers to how rainwater is stored in the ground. Again, another key component of the water cycle. And a complete scientific understanding of this water cycle didn't emerge until the 17th century, thanks to people like Pierre Perrault and Edmund Halley. Before that, Aristotle's theory on water circulation dominated a lot of scientific thought. He believed that rainfall alone couldn't account for the river flow, and that there must be some type of like underground channel or like an ocean inside of the earth that then would, lead rivers around the world. A theory that persisted, in some ways into the Renaissance. There's actually another verse in the Quran that talks about the waves and how waves work. So in Surah An-Nur, chapter 21, verse 40, and it says this, "Or like the darkness in a deep sea, it is covered by waves, above which are waves, above which are clouds. Darkness, some above others. When one puts out his hand, he can hardly see it." The verse describes something that humans would have a hard time observing directly in the 7th century, the layered darkness of the deep ocean and the phenomena of these underwater waves. Today, we understand that Light penetration in ocean creates distinct layers of darkness. The longest wavelengths, like red on like the Roy G. Biv spectrum, they disappear first, and then orange, then yellow, green, etc. And it kind of goes into, this verse where it says darkness some above others. Again, talking about the the spectrum of light as it dissipates the farther down you go. Even more remarkable is this mention of waves above waves. We typically think of waves as, just on the ocean surface, but oceanographers have now discovered that internal waves occur between water layers of different densities below the surface. These subsurface waves can be massive, sometimes hundreds of feet high and miles long, but remain completely invisible from the surface. They exist deep, deep in the depths of the ocean. Many of them were, first reported in like the 1800s, 1893 to be exact, by a Norwegian explorer, Fridtjof Nansen, who experienced these strong resistance with his ships, and they were, in seemingly calm waters that he, described as dead water. And these internal waves weren't officially discovered until the 20th century when oceanographers made special tools to detect the changes in water density. Again, that one's pretty good. The waves below the waves. Like, is it possible it's just a metaphor? Sure. But again, I don't know what the nature of Arabic or Middle Eastern, seafaring was at the time. I don't know if they would have been able to detect something like that. Maybe like a deep net or something. I don't know. I don't even know how deep people were swimming back then. Like, would you have gone so deep that you couldn't see anything? I feel like without modern, scuba diving equipment, it'd be pretty hard to do that. That's a pretty good one. I don't know. I like the cosmology one. I feel like it kind of moved me a little more, but that one's still pretty good. I like that one. There's another one also on the oceanic barrier. So there's a verse, Surah al-Furqan, chapter 25, verse 53, and it states, "He is the one who merges the two bodies of water, one fresh and palatable and the other salty and bitter, placing between them a barrier they cannot cross." Another similar description comes in a later verse. It says, "He merges the two bodies of fresh and salt water, yet between them is a barrier they never cross." These verses describe something that seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, how can two bodies of water meet but not fully mix? Well, if you don't know, at the mouths of rivers where fresh water meets the salty ocean, there's a boundary zone where the two waters don't immediately mix because of the differences in temperature and density, salinity, all that stuff. And it creates a visible boundary where they meet. Christos, could you actually Google like brackish water or maybe like more specifically these kinds of phenomena? And they can be observed in places like, the Atlantic, the Arctic Ocean. And one of the most famous examples is in the Amazon, where the Amazon River meets the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see the different colors of water flowing side by side for miles before they gradually mix over time. Another phenomena of a similar style occurs at the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean and the Atlantic meet. They have different salinities. And French oceanographer, actually, Jacques Cousteau, described his astonishment when exploring the water barriers at the Strait of Gibraltar, noting how the Mediterranean and the Atlantic waters maintained their distinct properties and boundaries for quite some time. This scientific observation came, hundreds of years after the Quran described the phenomena. What's interesting about all these geological and like ocean-related explorations of the Quran is how, it seems like they're pretty, on the point. Can we go to go to the images? You can see actually. Like that one right there, you could see these points. And I'm curious if Muslim scientists in the region would have even known about this. Like, I don't even know. I have no idea where that is, but I'm curious, like if they would have seen it. Cause obviously if you observe it, you can see it, but I don't know if they would have even had the chance to observe it. Maybe like some traveler far away. I don't know. That's another pretty good one. But again, what's interesting about all of these is like, the Earth's crust, all this stuff would have been, if you asked me, if I had no access to modern technology or Google or ChatGPT or any of that stuff, I feel like my guesses would have been farther off. So these are pretty good. I'm again, as a Catholic, I find these to be pretty solid. What do you think, Christos? I mean, you think they're on something here?
You think you have it bad as a Catholic? I'm a ethnocentric Greek.
Yeah, I mean, the Greeks, you guys screwed all that stuff up.
Yeah.
You guys weren't even close.
Apparently.
Way back in the day, who knows? When was the last time there was like a Greek scientist or philosopher that was like really on it? A few thousand years?
Aristotle, something like that.
There's got to be someone in like the 1900s that like went to college.
No, we're too busy taking coffee and cigarette breaks.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cigarettes really ruined so many Greek innovations.
Yep.
But the coffee is good. Those Greek frappuccinos with like little foam on the top. Yeah, those go crazy. All right, we got a couple other ones, shall we? Human embryonic development. This one is interesting. This was pointed out to me by a friend on Instagram, and yeah, again, I'd never heard of this. I never read any of this. I didn't grow up reading the Quran, but it says here in Surah al-Abinya, an Anbiya. I hope I'm pronouncing these correctly. Sorry if I'm messing them up. Chapter 21, verse 30, it says, "Have those who disbelieve not considered that the heavens and earth were a joined entity, and we separated them, and made from water every living thing? Then will they not believe?" So again, this is related to the verse we read earlier, but it has that, additional verse at the end. We separated them and made from water every living thing. So we talked about this cosmic separation, but water making up every living thing is interesting. There's actually other verses that state, that water is the life force of all things that are living. It's pretty solid. As we know now, biology has told us that water makes up about, somewhere between 60 to 75% of the human body, and as much as 90% of some plants and simple organisms. Basically every known form of life, even like the tiniest little bacteria to like big mammals, requires water to survive. There's basically no exceptions to this rule of anything living. I mean, can you Google that? Like, are there, like, I don't know of anything that can live without water, like any living thing that can live without water. I'd be so curious. So according to a Google search, while all known life on Earth requires water, some can survive extended periods of time without it. There are these water bears that are able to survive for a long time without water in a dehydrated state, but at a certain point, they all require water to live. So there you go. What is a water bear? Can we get a picture of that? They can live decades without water? I mean, that's crazy. But it makes it interesting, right? Like the, DNA, like the double helix that Watson and Crick pointed out, requires water molecules. Things like our natural body function. Oh, that's a water bear?
Apparently.
Whoa, that thing. Thank goodness those things aren't big. That is a crazy looking thing. It's like a microorganism.
I think so.
Bro, how wild is that? That we're probably drinking those things all the time. Where are they? What are they doing all day, these water bears? That is a wild looking thing. We need to do a whole episode on water bears. New topic. We're pivoting hard because these water bears just blew my whole mind. That is crazy. It's a phylum of an 8-legged segmented microanimal. A microanimal?
Mm-hmm.
What the heck? They were discovered in the 1700s? I mean, that must have blown his mind. 1773. America didn't even exist. And he's reading about micro bears. No one believes him for sure. He's like, dude, there's bears in the water. They'd be like, you're out of your mind. But yeah, there you go. That's pretty interesting. They all living things require water, and they knew it. I guess that's a bold statement. If I was living in the 7th century, I don't think I would have been like every living thing, because I would be like, maybe rocks are living. I don't know. But they put it out there, maybe divinely inspired by Allah. Maybe it was a guess. It's a tough guess to make, but they nailed it. What about human development? Embryology is another point that people, Muslim scholars will point out. It says here in the Quran, Surah al-Mu'minun, I think that's how you say it. Chapter 21, verses 12 to 14. "And certainly we created man from an extract of clay." I believe that as a Catholic, that's in the Bible, right? Shout out. Okay, so I'm on board. "Then we placed him as a drop of sperm in safe lodging." I like that. "Then we made the sperm into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump of flesh, and we made out of that lump bones, and we clothed the bones with flesh, and we developed him into another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators." I mean, that's a pretty detailed process of, like embryological development of a human. So as we understand this idea of the drop of sperm, in Arabic, this is the nutfa, which literally means the liquid that produces life. And this accurately, identifies conception beginning with the male sperm. And while this might seem obvious now, many ancient cultures didn't really understand what exactly that meant. They didn't understand that, they believed in potentially like spontaneous generation, or even this idea that tiny, fully formed humans existed inside sperm cells, and then they grew into full-sized humans. And then the next stage, you have this clot, in Arabic is known as alaka. And this is a term that's interesting because there's 3 distinct meanings, all of which accurately describe the embryo in the stages of development from like 7 to 24 days. One of the meanings is leech-like. Under a microscope, the early embryo bears a striking resemblance to a leech with its curved shape and bulging top proportion. It also means a suspended thing. the embryo attached to the uterine wall and hangs suspended within the womb. And of course, the blood clot that we're probably more familiar with. The embryo is surrounded by maternal blood as implantation occurs, and the embryo itself contains pooled blood. So Dr. Keith Moore, this prominent embryologist who authored the textbook, The Developing Human, particularly struck by this terminology. He noted that the word alaka provides an apt description of the embryo's appearance and behavior during the stage in ways that would have been very difficult to know prior to microscopic examination. So again, that's a doctor. That's Keith Moore. Talk to him about it. I don't know. After this, the Quran describes this lump of flesh, the Arabic word, as mudga, which specifically refers to something that appears to have been chewed with tooth marks still visible. Remarkably, days 24 to 28, the embryo develops somites. These blocks of tissue basically form along the back of the embryo that give it sort of, they eventually become like the vertebrae and the muscles, and they kind of create this pattern of ridges and depressions that kind of almost look like a tooth mark or a chewed substance. And then you have this idea of, the lump of bones, right? So there's this idea of ossification that occurs after, and basically the skeletal system forms from that. And then after the skeletal system, you have the muscles that literally clothe the bones as they develop and attach to the skeletal structure. To add on to that, there is another verse, Surah Az-Zumar, chapter 39, verse 6, which mentions Allah creates you in the womb of your mothers, creation after creation, within 3 veils of darkness. Now, some scholars and scientists have said that these 3 veils of darkness correspond to the 3 anatomical layers that protect a developing fetus. You have the abdominal wall, which is the mother's, stretched stomach layer that you can actually see and touch. And then you have the uterine wall, which is the strong, muscular wall of the womb that, expands as the baby grows. And then you have the amniochloronic membrane, a special fluid-filled sac made of the 2 connecting membranes that surround and cushions the developing baby. So that's pretty good. The 3 developing walls of darkness that's described in the Quran apparently still connects to embryology as we know it now. Now, that's solid. What about this one? If that's not blowing your mind, how about this? Surah As-Sajdah, chapter 32, verse 9. It mentions, "Then he fashioned him and breathed into him of his spirit and appointed for you hearing, sight, and hearts." Now, Muslim scholars will point out the order: hearing, then sight, then hearts, or potentially understanding. Now, modern embryology confirms that the auditory system begins developing before the visual system. That's pretty interesting. The auditory apparatus begins forming in the 3rd week and becomes functional by the 4th month. Meanwhile, the eye starts developing in the 4th week, but its structures aren't fully formed until much later, and then the brain regions responsible for understanding develop even after that. Once again, this is all, pretty interesting. If a kid came to you and he was like 12 years old and he's like, "This is what I think," you'd be like, "Whoa, that's pretty fascinating." Now, of course, Muhammad wasn't a kid, but he was just a man that lived 1400 years ago and wrote all this down and had a pretty decent understanding of embryology. Again, this guy, Dr. Keith Moore, he was so impressed by these Quranic descriptions. I'm assuming Keith Moore is not, Muslim, right? The idea of, I don't think Keith Moore is a very Arabic name, but he incorporated them into his embryology textbooks. And after studying these verses, he said, "It's clear to me that these statements must have come to Muhammad from God, because almost all of this knowledge was not discovered until many centuries later." I wonder if he converted. That'd be interesting to know. This guy's pretty white, but Muslims can be white. I guess that's not, that's not the obvious description if I was going to think. But yeah, apparently Keith Moore has. I'm curious. Can you find out if he converted?
Sure.
That's really interesting. Critics will often argue that the modern, I'm not sure if he converted. We'll figure that out later. So I should point out that some critics, will argue that these modern interpretations of the Quran retroactively impose scientific meanings onto the ancient texts, like the original Arabic terms meaning, like a leech-like form or the chewed lump carry these specific vivid meanings that align with what we now can observe under a microscope. Furthermore, the sequence of development stages described in the Quran follows a scientific accurate timeline, unlike many of the other ancient texts that, present them in maybe, jumbled orders of growth. Some critics have often pointed out that, it's possible that they borrowed this idea from the Greeks and that, the Greeks maybe had it correct. But it's interesting to point out that Galen and Hippocrates, They had theories that had many significant errors about embryonic development that are not present in the Quranic